Leaky fig is the leaky fig. We are doing stuff and making stuff, the leaky fig. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all feeling rested. I am still drinking my first cup of coffee, so I hope that you have yours close by, maybe second or third cup even. I'm not sure how many I'm going to need, but great. So today we're going to be making some pain au levain, or as it's commonly known, sourdough. Just a little explanation of why I don't call it sourdough. I think that conjures a very specific bread in a lot of people's minds. They think of kind of a San Francisco sourdough, which has a very strong sour flavor. And what we're making today is going to be a little bit different than that. Classic San Francisco sourdough typically uses a stiff starter, number one, and you get kind of a punchier flavor from that. And then they're really going for like a strong sour taste, whereas the pain au levain is actually it's naturally leavened. So we're not using any commercial store-bought yeast in this. It's all a culture that we've grown and developed naturally from the yeast in our own environment. There's yeast on pretty much everything. They're just microscopic plants, basically, and they feed on grape skins, fruit skin. They exist in the air, they exist on plants and everything else. So what we've done by building our starter here is to kind of harvest some of those, give them water and then food in the form of sugars, starches, and nutrients from flour. And in their digestive process of breaking those compounds down, they release CO2, so gas, which gives us leavening, and they also release different acids, lactic acid, acetic acid, and those are giving us flavor and also some preservative properties. So yeah, that's kind of a little basic chemistry behind what's going on here. There are bacteria that are naturally associated with the yeast too, and our goal in making bread is to try and keep those pretty well balanced. Yeast get really active around 85, 90 degrees, and they'll just eat all of the food in their environment when they're that active, which is why we kind of slow the process down and cool everything down, and that gives the bacteria that are in there a chance to kind of eat at the same table, and they produce a lot of that really great acidity, that really good flavor. That's going to help give us those preservative properties, make our loaves last longer. So, recipes that tell you to use warm water, use 100-degree water or anything, that's going to move really, really quickly, and it's going to give you really good leavening, but not necessarily great flavor. So just in general, if I'm doing bread or yeasted products, I'm not trying to speed through things. I want really great flavor, and it's going to contribute to the dough strength to slow everything down. It's going to give us a better texture. It's just going to yield a better product overall. So as you're finding recipes online and experimenting with stuff, I almost always recommend not trying to go super warm on your water and your mixes and everything. Don't rush baking, and don't rush yeasted products especially. They're alive, and they'll do best when they can move at their own pace. So so we're going to do some pain au levain, and we're also going to make some sticky buns, which is great. I have these recipes crafted to be kind of overnight recipes. You can bake them the same day. The sticky buns need to go in the fridge for at least like 6 to 8 hours. Overnight is best, but if you start in the morning and you want to make them later tonight, you can do that, but the dough absolutely needs to chill. And it will be just way too difficult to try and work with if it's not quite cold anyways. So overnight is best for those. The bread is a little bit more flexible. I think it tastes better and it lasts a little longer if you retard it overnight in the fridge, but I have definitely made this loaf same day, and it comes out great. So that's up to you, however you want to work this. I've made a couple of batches yesterday so that I can show you all the way through the bake, hopefully. But the plan is going to be to make these doughs, get them to a certain point, and then throw them in the fridge overnight to finish tomorrow. So yeah, we're going to start with our pan au levain dough, and I will cut down to this camera here. So I have my flours here, and you can probably see I've got some whole wheat mixed in here. On the recipe, it called for 500 grams of flour, and you can use 50 grams of whole wheat, rye, spelt, any of those grains you can use to kind of supplement the flavor and you know, add a little dimension to your loaf, but it also does great with just straight bread flour. And if you got a flour kit from me, this shepherd's grain low gluten flour is what I gave you, and that's got really great protein content in it. It's not technically a bread flour. The protein content is probably a little bit lower than normal bread flour, but it makes beautiful bread. And if all you have on hand is AP flour, that's fine too. You might have to put a couple more folds on your dough, which is something I'm going to demonstrate for you today, just to build the strength, but you are going to be fine producing a loaf today with AP flour, so nope, don't panic. All right, so I've got my ingredients here. I've got my flours, I have salt, and I have my Levain, and then I cut up some olives because I love olive bread, so I'm going to be mixing those into my loaf. If you want to do like rosemary or thyme or lemon zest or nuts, you could do walnuts or cranberries, kind of whatever is to your taste, or if you just want to keep it straightforward and simple for this first try, no problem. I've got, I guess, maybe about a cup of these, and just a hint, if you're going to use something like olives, go ahead and give them a rinse first. They can be pretty salty, and they will also kind of color the loaf if you don't rinse them out. So I'm going to set these aside for now because we're not going to need them until a little bit later. And I'm going to grab some cold water here. So we're going to start with a fresh bowl, and to that bowl we're going to add our water. So it's going to be 350 grams. And again, you want your water to be pretty cool, right around 70 degrees is best. And then to our water, we're going to add 100 grams of this starter. So just to show you kind of what my starter looks like right now, when I first fed it, it was probably down about here, so it's grown quite a lot. It looks nice and aerated. I've got lots of bubbles kind of throughout. It feels really light and foamy. And then if you look at the top, it's also very, very aerated up there. I've got lots of bubbles sitting right on top. I have, yeah, I think you can see the bubbles here, and it has leveled out. So as it's rising, it'll be kind of domed, and then it will level out when it's like really ready to use, and then it'll start to fall again as it's over fermenting. So if yours has risen and then fallen again, you want to make sure you go ahead and feed it before you use it. Otherwise, it's just going to be a little weak in the leavening. It'll still taste fine and everything, but you might not get the rise that you want out of your loaf. So, or if you forgot to feed it last night, you know, just go ahead and feed it now, and after 6 or 7 hours sitting out on the counter, it should be super ready to go. So you can still make a loaf of bread with it today. So I think I'm actually just going to do this by hand. So I'm just going to dip my hand in the water and kind of wet it down, and then just kind of scoop some of this stuff out into my water. I'm looking for 100 grams. Great. So the rest of my starter, I can go ahead and save. I'm just kind of gonna clean up my edges here. If it's too far up on the side, it will dry out and get crusty. So to keep it nice and healthy, just scrape it all back down in there. And then I'm gonna pop this into the fridge, and I can feed it, you know, as soon as I have time. It'll last in the fridge for a long time too, so if I don't get around to feeding it today, that's fine. He's gonna be okay. So I'm gonna put him in the fridge. Come back over here. So I have my Levain just sitting in my water right now, and I'm just gonna kind of gently break it up and get it incorporated. It's easiest if you do this step first, because it's a liquid Levain. It'll dissolve and you'll get a better mix overall in your loaf if you kind of dissolve it in here first. And then next we're going to add our flour. Now I'm keeping my salt separate, and I'm not going to add it into this initial mix. We're going to do what's called an autolyze, and that is basically where you add your flour and your water, and oftentimes your Levain, to the mix, and you let them sit for 20 to 30 minutes to hydrate. And the reason you leave salt or sugar, if that's in your mix, out is because these are hygroscopic, which means you know, salt and sugar are hungry for water. They will pull it out of the cells of other things around them, and we really want the proteins in our flour to be very well hydrated to make this great loaf. So we're just going to wait to add the salt until we've given these guys a chance to fully hydrate. So I'm going to add all of my flour in here. And then I'm just going to kind of stir it together with my hand. Another reason to use nice cold water is that your flour will generally be more at room temperature. So if you mixed your Levain in and the water felt quite cold and now you're sticking your hands in here, it probably feels quite a bit warmer already. So if we had already started with warm water, you know, we'd have quite a warm mix going on, and it would move a little too fast. So all I'm trying to do here is get everything hydrated. I'm not trying to mix or develop gluten or anything. I just want to make sure that I get all this dry flour blended with some of the moisture in there, and it will continue to absorb as we let it rest for this autolyze period. And for this initial step, you don't really need to worry about having it in a ball shape. You can leave it nice and shaggy. We will start maintaining it in a ball shape after this. But for this step, we really just want the water to work its way in. So I think I've got everything pretty well mixed in here. And I'm just going to take my handy dandy bowl scraper, kind of scrape off my fingers, scrape down the edges of the bowl, and then I'm going to cover it and set it aside for about 30 minutes. Okay. If you don't have a bowl scraper, just do the best you can with a rubber spatula or something to clean the edges of your bowl. They're a handy tool, but you can definitely get by without them. And I've got some cling film here. Just going to cover that. And we will check on it at about 10:45. 30 minutes from now. So next we are going to start the mix of the sticky bun dough, and that is one that is likely to take some time and some effort. It's a rich dough, and it is not quite so rich, but not too far off from being as rich as a brioche dough. And so, you know, it's got quite a bit of fat in it. It's got butter, it's got milk powder, it's got egg and egg yolk. And that is all going to make this beautiful, moist, you know, delicate dough, but it's going to take some elbow grease from us to get it properly developed. I'll just say I made my demo dough yesterday, and I used a KitchenAid mixer, and it took probably 25 to 30 minutes on a pretty high speed to mix it. I did end up adding a little bit of flour to it, so today I'm going to work it on the bench to do it alongside anybody who doesn't have a KitchenAid mixer. We might end up needing to add a little flour, but I also adjusted the egg amount just slightly. So I'll show you that. It used to just say 2 whole eggs, but now we're doing 1 egg and 1 yolk, which is going to cut the moisture down a little bit, and I think that will help quite a lot. And then I added just a little bit of vanilla, just so we can have, you know, that little essence. If you are making this dough, you are totally welcome to add cardamom, to add orange zest, poppy seeds. I would add poppy seeds towards the end of your mix. Any type of seed or nut or, you know, grain of any sort that you want to add to your dough should come in at the end once it's fully developed, and you just kind of need to fold it in. And the reason for that is that you will develop all of this nice gluten, and then those additives will actually come in and kind of cut the gluten strands. So we don't want to be fighting against those as we're developing the dough. We just want to gently incorporate them at the end. So feel free to do that, but definitely wait until the mixing part is, the dough development part is pretty much done before you add that stuff in. Zest won't interfere too much, but yeah, anything that's kind of hard or firm, even wheat bran, can cut those gluten strands. So I'm just gonna have another sip of coffee. Maybe 4 sips of coffee. So yeah, just be prepared. This one might take a little while to develop, but that's okay. It'll be worth it, I promise. This is a really, really delicious sticky bun recipe, and I think you guys are gonna enjoy it. So, let me just check on how much water I need. 6 ounces. So I'm gonna grab a bowl here again and pour in 6 ounces of cold water. So if you did the challah with me, this is basically the same general mixing process, which is to say we want our liquid in first, and then we're gonna add our dry together over top, and we're just gonna mix them up a little bit before we add them in. So I've got my water in here, and I have my egg and 1 yolk here together. Feel free to save those egg whites, make more macarons, make more macaroons. I am probably going to be doing a cake demonstration at the end of the month, and I will show you how to make a meringue-based buttercream at that time, so you can save your egg whites for that. They will last, so yeah, hang on to them. So I'm going to dump my eggs in here, and just with a fork to help us out a little bit, I'm just kind of going to mix that together. And I'm also going to add just a little splash of vanilla, about a teaspoon. Mix that in, and okay. So I have sugar and milk powder. I have yeast, salt, and flour. So I'm going to go ahead and add my yeast, salt, sugar, and my milk powder in here. If you couldn't find milk powder, that is totally okay. It's a pretty common baking item, but I know things are scarce right now. If you want to use half milk so do half water and half milk, you can add back in some of that richness. And it will come out fine either way without this. So I'm going to add that in. Now I also have butter, but I'm going to hold off on adding the butter until I kind of get this stuff incorporated, and then I'm going to add the butter a little bit at a time as I start bringing the dough together. Because butter is a fat, and so that's shortening, which means it's going to make it hard for me to develop those gluten strands. But first I'm just going to take this and mix it by hand, just so we have some distribution of all of these ingredients. A lot of people I know have heard that you don't want to add your yeast and your salt together because salt kills yeast. That's a myth. Salt does not kill yeast. Salt slows yeast down. That's all it does. It slows down that fermentation process. which is fine. And frankly, sugar can do that as well, depending on how much of it is in your mix. They actually make a special type of instant yeast that's called osmotolerant, and that's meant for doughs with a significant amount of sugar in them. This would qualify for that, but our regular instant yeast is going to do fine. And a lot of that has to do with those hygroscopic properties, the fact that it's pulling the water away from, everything else and hoarding it for itself. So I've got everything well incorporated here, and that's good to do because there is some fat in here, and we don't want any of our yeast to get trapped in the fat, especially if we had oil or something. Sometimes it can surround that instant yeast and keep it from getting incorporated and starting to ferment. So we have a good mix, and we're just going to add it all over top. All right, so I'm kind of going to do the same motion here and stir it together. Just kind of start bringing this dough together. It already smells really good. And at this point, it feels really similar to that challah dough that we made. It's got almost the same ingredients in it. What is going to make this a richer, more tender, delicate dough is adding in this butter. And it's quite a lot of butter. It's definitely a significant amount. It's more than a full stick. So that's why we just kind of want to start bringing our dough together a little bit before we start adding that in, because it's going to make it hard for us to get this developed if we add it all in at the beginning. And this might take us a little while to mix anyways. Okay, so I've kind of got all of the loose flour picked up off the sides here. I'm going to switch to a full view so you guys can easily see what I'm doing here. And my dough's starting to feel tacky, which is good. That means that it's hydrated. And at this point, you can start adding in a little bit of butter. And you just want to do it a small piece at a time. We'll get it incorporated and then we'll add more. So I'm just going to take this guy right off the top. It's a pretty thin piece. You can kind of smear it around. It's going to be a lot easier if you use room temperature butter here. If your butter is too cold, it's just going to be that much more difficult to incorporate. And you'll feel as you are adding the butter in, it makes the dough quite sticky. It's hydrating it and making it a lot tackier here. You can probably already see that it's sticking to my fingers a lot more, but that's okay. We want a really nice, moist, delicate dough. So I'm going to add another chunk of butter here. And I think we can get the last of our butter incorporated here. I'm just going to take a little bit of dough and kind of clean out the excess butter here as best I can. Okay, and this will be the last of the butter to be incorporated, but we've still got a ways ahead of us as far as mixing this. We're going to be looking for something that you may have heard of before. It's the Windowpane Test, which is where if we're to grab a piece of our dough and pull it up, we should be able to pull it very thin so that it's translucent. You could basically see through it without it tearing. And that happens when you have really high gluten development. And that should happen as our dough starts to smooth out. It's still very, very shaggy, you know, kind of just tearing apart right now. It looks almost like a batter at this point. So we've got to really get in there to develop that gluten. But it will come together. Have faith. All right, so I'm going to take my bowl scraper and just kind of clean off my hands here a little bit and get ready to add our salt to our pan of Levain. Okay. Can't get every little bit off, but do the best that I can here. And just kind of scrape that excess dough down. We are going to come back to this. This isn't done, but I don't want any of that stuff drying out. So just going to scrape that in and then kind of set this guy aside and clean off my hands. And so I have my salt that we held back. It's about 10 grams of salt. And to that, I'm just going to add a little bit of water, about 2 tablespoons. Cold water, again. So it's 25 grams. And I'm just going to kind of, with my finger, dissolve the salt in here. Uniodized salt is the best for baking, so just kosher salt is really great. But if all you have on hand is iodized, just use a little bit less of it. It's more, the grains are smaller, the salt grains, so a teaspoon of that actually is a lot more salt than a teaspoon of kosher salt, and it will make your loaf quite salty. And it'll also, you know, it'll slow the yeast down a little bit. So I've just kind of got this dissolved. It's not, there's still some chunks in here, but it's going to be easier for me to incorporate it into my pan of Levain. Here I have our autolyzed dough, and if you touch it, it should actually feel pretty soft. Look at that. It's already quite moist and coming together. We didn't knead it at all, but it's already got some strength to it. See, I can almost pull a window here. And that's part of what that autolyze process does. Get everything nice and hydrated, start building that dough strength. So I'm just gonna add my salt in over top with that water. And we're just gonna gently incorporate it. This style of bread, we don't want to knead it like we're doing with the sweet roll. If you've seen recipes for no knead bread, this is kind of like that. We're not trying to get a really dense loaf here. We actually want some nice big holes, a nice open crumb is what it's called. So I'm just kind of gently incorporating that water and that salt in here. And then we're gonna put our first fold on the bread. And so last week we talked about punching and folding. So as the dough was rising, we punched it down, we punched the hollow dough down before we put it in the fridge. This is gonna be more of a folding process. There's gonna be not really any need to punch it down during the bulk fermentation, but we're gonna develop strength not by kneading the dough, but by pulling the dough up, stretching out those gluten strands, and then folding them over each other, and we're building really good structure by doing that. But we're also avoiding overworking our dough in that process. And the dough is kind of gonna tell us how many folds it needs. So what you do, I've got my water in the bowl right now, so it's pretty wet, but the easiest way if you don't have that water in the bowl is to wet your hands, and then you come in and you pull the dough. Let me see if I can okay, here we go. You pull the dough up. Don't stretch too far. You don't want to tear it, and we're just gonna fold it over. And then we're gonna turn the bowl and pull from the other side. Pulling the dough up, and as it starts to tear, fold it over. That's the dough telling you that that's as far as it wants to stretch. And then we come from the third side, do the same thing, pull and fold. And from that fourth side, pull and fold. You can see that the dough is already starting to smooth out. We've already got some good structure here. So I am just gonna kind of tuck in those edges and keep that nice round shape. That's gonna help trap the gases as the dough starts to develop, and strengthen it and build that gluten structure. So from this point forward, we're gonna always leave our dough in a nice rounded shape when we let it rest. And we're gonna let this rest for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes before we try and put our next fold on. We don't wanna develop it too quickly. We need the gluten that we just created, we want it to relax a little bit, for the salt to incorporate, for all of that stuff to start jiving together, basically. But if you are doing a fold-in of some sort, olives or herbs or spices, you can go ahead and take them and sprinkle them over top. We're gonna start incorporating this stuff, and you'll see we won't do it by kneading, but it's just gonna start getting folded into the dough. And I've just kind of sliced my olives here roughly, probably about twice or 3 times per olive. And we're going to cover it back up and set it aside. So this is a really great lazy weekend bread. You know, you can kind of start mixing it in the morning, just come back to it every hour or two, put a fold on, check on it. The shaping part is pretty easy, you know, like it's a pretty lazy type of thing, which is really nice, but the end result is beautiful and will feel like it took a lot more effort than it actually did. So that will be a great thing for us to enjoy. All right, back to this guy. I am at this point going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on my bench and scoop this out. And we're gonna keep working on him. I know it's a significant amount of effort, but it's going to be so worth it. So I'm just going to get a little bit of flour on my hands and keep kneading. Knead like your life depends on it. Because certainly the life of your sticky buns does. And it'll pick up some of that flour and then start getting sticky again. That's okay. Resist adding too much. We can flour our hands a little bit if we need to, but I don't want too much on the bench. This is where it's helpful to have a bench scraper. You can kind of reincorporate the dough if it starts getting too sticky and stretching too much. But working quickly and kind of pulling it up is going to help you with your development here. Like I said, this took quite a while, even in the KitchenAid mixer, so unfortunately we kind of have our work cut out for us, but that's why this was a good recipe to incorporate while we're waiting to put folds on our pan of Levain, because this part does take a little while. So all right, we're starting to get there. You know, it's still sticky. It's gonna be that way for a little while, but I can feel greater resistance as I'm pulling the dough, which is good. It's building some strength. In a few minutes, I'm gonna start preheating my oven, because I made a loaf of pan of Levain last night, and I want to be able to show you the bake on that. If you have a cast iron Dutch oven, that's going to give you the most authentic results as far as like a French style bread with a nice hearty crust on it, and you know, it'll give you really beautiful browning. The nice thing about the Dutch oven is that it keeps the heat really even, but it also traps the steam. So as the water is evaporating from the bread dough itself, that steam sits in that Dutch oven and steams the crust, which steam is a really vital element in forming crust on bread like that. There are steam injection ovens that are built just to produce that. You can also, if you don't have a Dutch oven, you can preheat a pan and pour some water into it to give it some steam and some continuous moisture throughout the bake. You can also use a squirt bottle and spray it down. There are a lot of workarounds for getting that steam in there, but it is going to yield the best color, the best texture, if you're able to bring some steam to that bake. So, however you need to do that, I would really recommend it. See how it's starting to pull up off? It's still sticky, but that is progress. We're really starting to develop some good gluten structure here. The butter is still going to keep it really tender and moist. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and check the structure here. It's definitely still sticky, but it's also smoothing out, and I just want to pull. So see, we're starting to get a little bit of a window here, but it's still breaking apart. And we want to be able to pull it really thin without it tearing. So we do need to keep working, but we're getting close. All right, oh man. This is definitely smoothing out a lot. Sticking a lot less, it's pulling together. It's getting to the point where I can kind of ball it up just by hand. So close. This is another reason why we want to use cold water when we're doing this. I'm mixing this by hand and my hands are warm, so that's infusing heat, and we're also creating a lot of friction in the process of rolling this dough out, and that's heating everything up. And so, you know, we don't want the dough getting totally proofed on us before we even have the chance to develop the structure. So that's why cold water is just really best. Even in a mixer, it's going to get really warm in the mixing process, even without the heat coming from my hands. That friction, you'd be surprised how much it can heat up your dough. Okay. So you can see how much smoother this is. And even if I tuck it down, it's kind of holding that skin. It's not tearing so much. That's the type of structure that we're looking for. That's what we're working so hard to get. And I have not added any more flour to it from that initial batch that initial sprinkling on the bench. I still have some left over here on the side. So you just really want to resist adding flour to it, because you're going to end up with a tough, dry, dense dough if you do that. And we want it to be tender and kind of melt in the mouth. And we are going to have that. All right, I feel pretty good about this. Yep, I think we're there. Sometimes you gotta kind of figure out where the best spot to pull your window is. But yeah, I can pull it quite a ways before it starts tearing on me. And like I say, it is going to develop some more in the fridge. So I'm happy with this. It feels nice and smooth. You know, it's definitely got the texture that I generally look for in a sweet and rich dough like this. So I think we can call it finally. And yeah, hopefully you can see how nice and smooth that looks. It's got a nice shine on it with all that butter in there. So I've gathered it into a nice ball. I'm gonna I have these sealed containers here. You can use a bowl and just cover it with plastic wrap. I'm gonna take a little bit of just vegetable oil. You really don't need a lot here. That was, I don't know, maybe a quarter teaspoon. You can just use your hands to spread it around. They're already covered in butter anyways. Get a nice good coat. This dough will probably stick a little bit anyways, but when it's cold, it'll be really easy to clean it out. And then we're just gonna pop them in there and let them sit out for an hour at room temperature, and then throw them in the fridge overnight. So yeah, you can see about how tall it is. It's gonna rise quite a bit. And I can actually show you what that looks like with the batch that I made yesterday. So, clean off my bench a little bit here. It's another nice thing about bench scrapers. Get all that excess stuff out of the way. This is the dough that I made yesterday. So it's quite a bit bigger. I've tempered it out of the fridge for basically the whole time I was kneading, so probably about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And you can see it's stuck a little bit. I didn't actually even oil this, so that's really not too bad. You can just scrape that out. And you can see how much bigger this one is, even though I've already degassed it a little bit. So I am going to add a little bit of flour to my bench for this next step. So this is the step you'll be doing tomorrow after your dough has chilled. And again, you don't want a ton, just enough so that it won't stick too much. You can use some flour on your hands. And we're going to press it out. Just kind of degas it. This is, you know, the punching phase. And a little bit of flour on top because we are going to roll it too. And I'm just going to take a quick pause, let this rest 1 second, and show you the cinnamon sugar. So that recipe is here, and it's just equal parts sugar and brown sugar with a little bit of cinnamon added in. Very simple, and you can stir that together by hand. You can do it with a fork if you want. I kind of like to start it with a fork just to mix everything around, and then I'll get in there and break up the brown sugar with my hands. It smells really good. And then I have some leftover brown sugar mixture from the challah that I made that I'm just going to add to this. It has a little bit of flour in it. That's totally fine. That's going to help keep this from melting out as much during the bake. And it's just, I mean, it's maybe a tablespoon of flour in here. So it's still mostly just a sugar mixture. And you just want it really well combined. So yeah, it should just look homogeneous. It's really simple little mix. And again, you can save this for quite a while in a sealed container. There's nothing in it, so long as you don't get it wet or anything, there's nothing in it to really spoil it. So it'll hold up for quite some time. And the next little part I want to show you while we let our dough rest is the glaze. So that recipe was also posted. I have all of those ingredients just sitting together in a container right here. So I've got my butter, cinnamon, honey, brown sugar, vanilla. It's all just right there. Some salt. I actually don't know if I remembered salt. I'm going to add a little pinch of salt. The salt will add just a nice little note. And it also helps intensify the flavor of the other things. So, which is why a lot of sweet recipes, you should still use salt. It just adds to the flavor. It won't make it taste salty per se, but it will make it pop a little bit. So, scrape this out into my pot. I'm going to set this over low heat. All I'm trying to do is melt that butter and dissolve the sugar. I don't want to really cook it or even get it too hot. I just want everything to be nice and incorporated and dissolve that sugar kind of liquefy everything. And this is what we're gonna put into the base of our baking pan. This will be the glaze that comes out on top. You bake it kind of like a pineapple upside down cake. It's a similar idea where you put like a caramel in the bottom of the pan and then you add your stuff over top. So I'm just gonna set this on the burner. And grab a rolling pin. Go back to, take my Dutch oven here. I've got this guy. It's like a Lodge, it's an American brand. It wasn't very expensive. It's enameled, which is nice, but if yours is not, you don't need to worry. You might want to add a little extra flour when you bake your bread, but the enamel will still stick to the dough, so I still flour it. So I'm going to put this in my oven while it preheats to 450 degrees. I want this hot when my dough hits it, as I'm going to bake the pain au levain. So, throw this in the oven. It's going to get nice and hot. I'm going to stir my glaze over here. It's just about ready. It smells amazing. I mean, brown sugar, butter, vanilla, cinnamon, honey. That's all the really good stuff. This is a great glaze too, because it stays nice and sticky, you know, it won't turn into like a hard caramel, but it also won't totally cook off in the baking process. So it just maintains a really nice texture, and you can use it for other things if you want to try making upside down cupcakes or do some other sweet roll type situation. You could even brush it on top of some sweet rolls or something and then just warm it. It's a really nice glaze. So, and I think it is just about done. I'm going to give it one more minute on there and come back over here, and we're back to our dough. So I'm going to add a little bit of flour to my bench. My dough feels really soft and slack, but it's still cold, which is great because it will get kind of sticky again once it warms up. So I'm actually going to roll it this way. We can get about 12 good-sized sticky buns out of this. And then I'm just going to even it out here. I don't want it to be too tall this way. You know, I think I want it to be somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch thick. We want to get a few rolls in our spiral, but we don't want it to be too thin so that it, you know, it dries out during the baking process. We want nice, gooey, chewy, doughy rolls when they come out of the oven. So don't feel like you need to really roll it out super, super far. This is probably about, maybe 18 or 20 inches long by about 9 inches tall. And I'm just gonna I'm kind of evening it out, making my corners in the same place. You want a nice, fairly even rectangle if you can. That's gonna give you the best rolls. I'm gonna shut my heat off on my glaze. that's ready to go. And we're going to take some softened butter and do just like we did with the challah. Spread a nice thin layer of it. You can use a knife, or I have an offset spatula here. Even a rubber spatula would work. You can also just use your fingers to do this. You've already had your fingers up in some butter today anyways, so no harm in that. The important part is going to be to leave a little edge here that is not covered in butter, because we want to be able to kind of seal these rolls. I'm just doing a thin layer. It should be translucent. You don't want your butter so thick, because otherwise your filling is going to just melt out on you, and that will be sad. Butter is delicious, but there is plenty of it in the dough. We're just adding a layer to basically act as adhesive for our cinnamon sugar. But we don't want so much on here that it all melts out. So that looks pretty good to me. And then you take and sprinkle your cinnamon sugar. And again, you want a nice hearty layer, but we don't want it piled on here. So I kind of spread it by hand, and as much as adheres to the butter is about the thickness I'm looking for. We don't want our cinnamon sugar to be translucent necessarily, but I also don't want like big piles of it stacked up on my dough. Now, if you want nuts or raisins or something like that, at this point you can sprinkle them on top. We're getting ready to roll these up. So sprinkle away if that's something you want to do. I am going to put pecans in as a topping, basically. So I'm not going to add nuts at this point. So I'm going to start at the bottom and take my dough and just pull it a little bit and twist it around. So pull it a little, twist it around. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm starting at the wrong end. This is going to be where we seal it. So we're starting at the top, and we're going to do that pull and twist motion. And you want to go pretty quick because your dough, you don't want it to warm up too much here. So we're just starting a little roll. I'm going to pull it down towards me. And you don't have to do it super tight. If you roll these too tight, they're going to want to pop up in the center. So, you know, we don't want any big gaps, but we don't want them to be too tight either. And I just try to keep it even as I'm coming down. You can stretch the dough a little bit at the ends to keep a nice clean edge if you need to. And you should be able to kind of feel if there's like some extra dough in some place that needs shifted downward or something like that. I'm kind of stretching my ends here to keep it nice and even. And then at this point, we're basically ready to seal. So I'm just going to kind of clean off my bench. I don't want excess flour or anything here. And I'm going to roll it over on itself so that that seam, that edge is on the bottom. And I'm just going to kind of like press it gently against the table to create a light seal there. And you can see when I roll it back over, it's not a super tight seal, but that's okay. We just want a nice light one. And I kind of even out the dough. And then I'm going to cut it into 12 pieces. So So I recommend using a knife here instead of a bench scraper. Something a little sharper is going to be easier. And I'm just going to start in the center and cut, and then cut it in half again. And then if I want 12, I've got to get 3 out of each quarter. So, you know, you can kind of score it like that. They should be about that thickness. And the ends, sometimes I cut a little taller because they tend to get a little less of the whole mix in them. And that way you can even them out a little bit. And if we take a look, we've got a nice spiral there. So yeah, I think this will be a really good size for these guys. My dough's already getting pretty slack, so I want to go ahead and fill my pan, get that ready to go. I'm just using a classic muffin pan here. You can use a cake pan and kind of like pack them in like pull-aparts. They might take a little longer to bake that way. They probably will take a little longer to bake that way, so just be aware of that. And then you might get some browning on the edge ones while the center ones are still a little softer, which is kind of why I like this style pan for these sticky buns. So I have some pecans here, and I have my glaze, and I'm just going to pour my glaze into a little measuring cup. If your glaze is cooled and it's not really liquidy anymore, you can use a spoon to fill your little muffin rings. But we basically just want to cover the bottom. You don't want to put, it's probably like, I don't know, a tablespoon and a half. We don't want to fill them up too much. It's just gonna bubble out of the pan if we do that. And it can also kind of mess with the shape of your sticky buns. So I'm not using a whole lot here. It will be plenty sweet and plenty moist with just this amount, I promise. Plus, you have extra glaze. You can always drizzle more on top if you so desire. But for the baking part, you can be a little scant. So then I'm just gonna put my pecans in the bottom here, kind of just as many as I want. I like it to be pretty densely packed in. If you just want a few, these are just the pecan pieces that I've got here. You can chop them up finer. You can use whole pecans and make kind of like a little design. You can do whatever suits your creativity and your tastes here. This is just kind of how I like it. Some nice even distribution. And yeah, just kind of make sure they're evenly in there. And we're gonna start putting our rolls in. So this is an end piece, so it's, you know, it's a little messier looking. I'm gonna, as you think about it, these are baking upside down. So this is the top. The top faces down. So, and I just kind of pressed it in a little bit. So the next one is gonna go in, and I'm just lightly pressing. I'm not smushing. I'm not getting too aggressive here. Just kind of lightly pressing them in. And they should be cut pretty evenly. They should all be about the same size. If you're worried about your pan sticking, you can butter it or spray it down. I think that these are going to come out of this pan okay. The glaze should kind of keep it from sticking too much, but who knows, that could be famous last words. We'll find out soon enough. And then, yeah, so I've got them all in my pan, like so. They look nice and spiraled and very inviting. And these are gonna proof for, probably an hour to an hour and a half. They feel, you know, they're definitely already proofing, but they are gonna grow and soften. So I'm just gonna lightly cover them in some cling film and set them aside at room temperature to do their thing. And with your film, you want it to keep them from drying out, but you don't want to put it on so tightly that they can't expand. So I kind of just lay it over top and make sure that, you know, there's no edges that are exposed to the air, but I'm not trying to wrap it super tightly. Here. So then I've got my pan au levain, my olives sitting on top, just like I want it. And I don't know if you can tell, but the dough has really like spread a lot. So, you know, that's the gluten relaxing in it and everything. But it's also risen, and as I touch it, it feels airier. So I'm gonna put my folds on. I got my hands wet, and I'm gonna reach up under the top of the dough and fold it over. We're just pulling and stretching as much as the dough wants to, right? I'm not trying to force it here. It's gonna tell me what it wants. Oh, lost an olive. And I'm doing this from basically like the 4 cardinal directions, if that's how you want to think of it. North, south, east, west. And got my olives. They won't be like super evenly distributed right now, but don't worry about that. Through the folding process and the shaping process, we're gonna get them a lot more evenly distributed. So one more olive here, and then I've tucked it back into a nice little ball. So this is kind of how it looked before we put that most recent fold on, and you saw how it kind of like soups out a little bit. That's what should be happening, that's how it should look, but now we're gonna bring it back into a ball, build that strength, trap that gas, and develop all that gluten, just as much of it as we want. So cover this guy back up, check him in about an hour to do another fold. All in all, about 3.5 hours is a good bulk fermentation for a loaf like this. So I think in about an hour, I'll put a fold on it. Maybe I'll push it. I'll do it in like 30 minutes. I'll put another fold in. You want to leave at least 15 minutes between folds, because the dough needs to relax. But for the sake of time, I'll do one in 30 minutes, and then I'll let it rest for 15, and then I'll show you how to shape it, and then hopefully we can wrap this up by 1. So let me show you the loaf that I made last night, and we'll bake it. So I'm gonna go through the shaping process with you guys. But this is the loaf that I formed last night of pan au levain. And I've got it here in a banneton. This wicker basket is called a banneton. If you don't have one of these, use a bowl. Just grease it very lightly with some oil, and then sprinkle it with flour so that it doesn't stick to the sides of the bowl too bad. If you have rice flour, that's even better because it breathes a lot better and it will get less gummy than regular flour. But if you don't, just liberally apply flour, you'll be fine. But even this, I'm gonna kind of go around the edges and release it a little bit from the edge of the mold here. And it feels really airy and proofed. I just pulled this straight from the fridge. This has not been sitting out at room temperature at all, but it feels ready to bake. So we're gonna go straight into the oven. I am going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on here. If you see that shine, it's quite moist on top, and this is actually the bottom of the loaf that we're looking at right now. So I'm gonna flip it out into my Dutch oven, and it will stick like the dickens if I don't flour it a little bit. So you don't need a lot, just enough to kind of contend with that moisture, the condensation from sitting in the fridge, and that should be good. So I've got that. My Dutch oven has preheated in the oven at 450. I'm just gonna grab a razor so that I can score the bread, and then we're gonna flip it out. I have what's called a lame at work, and it's basically just a handle for a razor that you use to score bread, but it is at work. So I have this pack of little razors here. Let's see if I can show you, that I just ordered online. If you don't have these, just use the sharpest knife that you have. A small knife will be better. It'll be easier for you to get in there and kind of cut the dough. And then you also just want to go quick. Like, quick movements will create less sticking and pulling when you go to score it. And if you don't have a razor, I would just recommend really simple scoring. You know, you can do one big slice right over the top. You could do a little square right in the center. Or you could do a couple of cuts. Just like simple straight lines are going to be your best bet if you are scoring with a knife, or also if this is new for you. I wouldn't try to get too fancy if you've never scored bread before. So, and I mean, I have scored bread before and I still try to get too fancy sometimes and it doesn't quite turn out. So I'm gonna pull out my Dutch oven. I'm just gonna lay down a towel here so I don't hurt my countertop. So again, this is very hot. Be careful when you're transferring this down. You know, we've got to kind of do like a swift movement of tipping the dough out into the oven, but it's 450 degrees. So, you know, try not to touch the edges. Be careful. And if you make sure that your dough is well released from the edge of your mold, that's going to help you a lot here. So I'm just going to take my, I don't know what's best here. Yeah. So I've got my banneton here. I'm ready to flip. I'm going to center it as best I can. Oh, sticking a little bit. Well, that didn't work. That's okay. Because I floured the bottom of the loaf, I'm able to move it around into the center where it needs to go. One nice thing about the banneton too is it gives me this kind of nice spiral which is, you know, a nice decorative element. So I've got my dough flipped out here, and I think I'll just show you guys a pretty simple score here. I'm just gonna do a square, and if I think of the center of the loaf, I don't want to go too far down the edges. I just want to keep it like right on the flat part of the center. And I'm just doing it carefully again so I don't burn my fingers here. So yeah, just a real simple square is what I've got. Scored there, or diamond if you like. And I'm gonna lid this and throw it in the oven. We're gonna start with 30 minutes. It's gonna take about an hour to bake, but we might give it a rotation at 30 minutes, and then we, at 45, will probably take the lid off and let it finish baking without the lid. Okay, so I'm just looking at the sticky bun dough here. It feels really great, really nice and relaxed. It's definitely soft. I think it's proofing a little bit, it's moving a little bit, but most of that process is going to happen in the fridge overnight. That's where it's going to get a lot of that fermentation, and the bulk fermentation is what it's called, will happen in the fridge. And because the dough got quite warm as we were developing it and kneading it, don't worry too much about it not fermenting enough while it's in the fridge. You know, we really infused quite a bit of heat into it, and there's some sugar in here, there's a lot of food for the yeast that we put in, so it's going to be really happy in the fridge. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this in at this point. And then, yeah, you just pick up with this dough where I showed you with the rolling and buttering and sprinkling and slicing and panning. But you can do that tomorrow, or at least 6 to 8 hours from now. It definitely needs to be cold, and it also just needs that time to ferment. So if you can wait until tomorrow, that's going to be your best bet. So, okay. I'm going to pull the pan of Levain over here, put one last fold on it. You can see from that circle shape that we had, it's already started to like spread a little bit, which is good. That means that our gluten has relaxed since the last fold we put on. So again, just cardinal directions. I'm stretching it up and pulling it over, then coming from the opposite side. And it's already got a lot less stretch than, you know, even the last fold. So we're getting some good structure developed here. And just take these stray olives and poke them in, pull from this last side. And now at this point, you can even see I have pretty good olive distribution. They are going to get even further distributed and incorporated when we shape it, but you know, they were all dumped in the same place, and now they're pretty evenly distributed throughout the bread. So and we didn't have to mix it in and grind it in and break up the gluten that we have been working on. Just got folded in, which is really nice. I'm tucking it in for that nice circle shape, and gonna cover it. I'll come back to it in like 15 minutes and show you how to shape it before you throw it in the fridge. So my bowl's a little big for this piece of cling film that I got. And it's hard for me to stretch it over at this point. I'm gonna make it work. I hate wasting. I hate it. So I will force it to work. Okay, wonderful. I'm digging around in my fridge and searching for projects. Here's the vegan chocolate mousse that we made yesterday. And you can see, quite stable. And I'll just show you how it looks. I can really set it up on a spoon, you know, like it's a proper mousse, really, which is kind of crazy when you think that it's literally just a little bit of melted chocolate, some non-dairy milk, and some blended up dates, and that's it. We didn't have to cook it, just melted the chocolate, which you can do in the microwave, honestly, and mixed it all together. And it tastes lovely. It's nice and light, definitely a really rich chocolate flavor, plenty sweet, but there's no like processed sugars in here. All of the sugar was either already in the chocolate or came from the dates. We didn't add any other sugar to it, so, but it is definitely like a dessert. It tastes nice and sweet. So yeah, the mousse came out great. This is a really lovely recipe. Honestly, people are never gonna know that it's vegan. You don't even have to tell them because it's just a really easy mousse to make. So if you don't have a lot of time to fuss with a chocolate mousse that, you know, has eggs in it or gelatin or anything like that, like this is a really great option. And it feels decadent. You can definitely top it with some berries, some whipped cream, some whipped coconut cream, some candied fruits, candied nuts, whatever is to your liking. You can dress it up however you would normally dress up chocolate mousse. Just make sure that you serve it chilled. It will definitely start to become less stable. It's not going to turn to liquid, but it will become less like stable and stiff as it warms up. So serving it chilled is the way to go. All right, let's check on our bread. Oh, where did I put my, aha, pot holders. Let me cut down here so you guys can see. It smells lovely. Put my towel down again. And if I take this off, voila, it is rising. It is looking beautiful. You can see it's still really pale. I'm gonna pop the lid back on before all that steam escapes. But yeah, it definitely wants more time. But we've got a great oven spring. That initial rise out of the heat from the oven is called oven spring. And we're getting some really great rise out of it. It's holding its shape nicely. All of that is gonna end up being, I think, a really great loaf. So I'm excited to see it. And I have now killed enough time that I think I can show you how to shape your own loaf. Your very own loaf. So I set my timer for, I guess I should just do another 30 minutes here, or 15 minutes. Yeah, in about 15 minutes I'm going to take the lid off and let it continue cooking and browning with the lid off for the last part of the bake. But we are now ready to shape this guy. So first things first, get your mold ready. I'm going to go ahead and reuse this Banatone. So I'm just going to tap out the old flour. I don't want to use the old flour because it might be kind of gummy, and the point of this is to keep it from sticking. So, my Banatone is going to be a little moist anyways, just from sitting in the fridge overnight with the dough in it. So I just scraped out the old flour in there, and I'm going to add some fresh stuff, and hopefully that will be enough to keep it from sticking. So I'm just going to sprinkle it in a hefty amount on the bottom, and then you really got to make sure that you get up the sides. And this is true if you're using a Banatone or a bowl. And remember, if you're using a bowl, go ahead and lightly oil it so that your flour will adhere to the oil. Otherwise, it's just going to all slide down into the bottom of the bowl. And I'm just getting it up on these edges here, these ridges of my Banatone, so that the sides of the loaf won't stick too much. So I've got a good hearty coat on here. And then, I guess I need some bench flour. Sprinkle just a little bit of flour out on the bench. You don't need too much. And I'm gonna tip the loaf out. Okay. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour right on top, not a lot, just enough so that when I'm kind of touching it, my hands aren't sticking too bad. I can also put some flour on my hands to prevent that sticking. And we still have some olive grouping and stuff, that's fine. We're shaping it, we're going to keep developing the dough and moving stuff around. So we're going to start by kind of making like a vertical rectangle. And this is why you don't want too much flour on your dough, because we are going to start sealing it together. So I'm going to fold the bottom up halfway and give it a nice light seal, just like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the top. So I'm just kind of stretching it so that it's, holding that rectangular shape, and I'm going to fold it to the center of the fold that I just made and give it a light seal. So I didn't fold all the way down to the edge of the bread, I just folded it to the center here. And then I'm going to rotate it. Okay? So a little bit of flour, got a real wet spot. I'm going to kind of smack it a little bit, flatten it out, degas it. This is more the punching stage. We did folding. We didn't really need to do any punching, but now we're punching it down a little bit as we're shaping it. And so from the bottom, I'm going to pull this up to about 2/3 of the way up and give it a good hard seal. I'm using kind of the blade of my pinky, and I'm pressing that dough down into the seal. And if it's really sticking, just get flour on your hands here. And then I'm going to pull the top of the dough, this last third that's left over, all the way around to the other side. So I kind of have a big fat burrito right now. Okay, so it's all the way around to the other side. I'm going to come to the dough from the sides here and scoop it up. And as I'm scooping, I'm tucking the sides underneath so that instead of a burrito shape, I now have something kind of round. And then kind of getting excess flour out of the way. I'm gonna want a little bit for my hands for this next part, but I don't want a lot of flour on my bench. It's really similar to when we were rolling the challah. We kind of need the dough to stick to the bench a little bit and get pulled in tight. But at this point, if you touch it, it should already feel pretty tight, like a nice firm loaf. You know, we had a really slack, loose, kind of wet dough when we dumped it out onto the counter. At this point, it should feel pretty solid, you know. This dough isn't going to be pushed around too easily right now. So I'm going to take my hands. Don't worry if they're sticky and covered, you know, just dip them in some flour. And let me rotate so you can see. So I've kind of got my ends tucked up under here, got a little booty crack. And I'm going to pull this dough underneath. I think you can see where it's pushed up against the counter in my finger. And I'm pulling it and turning. And I'm gonna come pull and turn. And you can lift it up as you go and get it back into position. And I'm pressing the dough down into the table and I'm turning. And so that's pulling the dough from, it's forcing the dough from the top to kind of like stretch down underneath and tighten the shape. And it's also creating a seal down at the bottom. And I'm just gonna keep doing that until I've got a nice tight loaf. But I don't want to pull it so tight that it tears. It might tear a little bit around the olives, that's okay. But I don't want this part to tear. I'm almost where I need to be. And as I get to that point, I'm just going to even it out a little bit by twisting it like this on the bench. And that'll kind of even out my circular shape a little and seal it and tighten just a little bit more. So now we have like a nice round shape. This shape is called a boule or ball, I think is the translation there. So pretty on point. And then I'm just gonna take a little dough here and kind of tuck that olive back in a little bit. I've got a nice tight shape on here, so it doesn't wanna pull over too easily, but these olives will get a little singed in the baking process if they don't have a little covering. So just gonna kind of try to help it out there a little bit. And then I'm gonna come in with my bench scraper. I've got it upside down now, so this is the bottom. And I'm going to put it with the bottom side facing up into my mold. And if you notice it kind of like settling a little bit and spreading, like your shape didn't totally seal at the bottom, just kind of pull these ends over. You know, the bottom is usually pretty sticky at this point, and you can just kind of pull that, make sure it holds its shape, stays nice and tight. Pinch in the olives there if you're making an olive bread or a nut bread of some sort. Kind of cover those up. And that's it. This will probably take a little bit of practice. These shapes, you know, they are kind of muscle memory and getting a sense of like how tight it needs to be. So if you bake your loaf and it spreads a little bit more than you thought, you were hoping that it would rise a little taller, but it ends up being a little bit more pancakey. That's probably just that your shape wasn't quite tight enough. Or perhaps you needed to put one or two more folds on your bread. If you're folding the dough and it's still really, really slack and kind of tearing and stuff, keep folding it. It needs more strength and development at that point. That's what it's trying to tell you. So yeah. But this is the basic shape. of a boule. There are actually lots of ways of shaping bread. So if you find a way that works better for you and you can still get a nice tight boule out of it, go for it. If you want to watch some YouTube videos and see how other people are doing this stuff, if the twisting on the counter thing is just too difficult, you can't kind of make that agree, then that's totally fine. There are 100 ways to skin a cat and even more ways to shape a loaf of bread. So do what works for you. I'm just going to lightly cover this with some cling film, throw it directly, at this point it's shaped, I'm going to throw it directly into the fridge and retard it overnight. And then go into the baking part, which I have already demonstrated for you guys tomorrow. I'm just going to rinse my hands first. Okay, and some cling film here. There we go. And it's not really going to want to stick to this wooden banneton. That's okay. I don't need an airtight seal on it. I just want to cover it so that it doesn't get like a crust on it from drying out in the fridge overnight. So, so long as I have it covered, it should be just fine. These bannetons are nice too because they do actually breathe. And that is good for the bread. They don't cause it to dry out too much, but they do allow it to breathe. So I am also pulling out my sticky bun so that those can continue proofing at room temperature, because we're almost done baking the bread, which means my oven will be free and I can move on to, sorry, sink's getting kind of full. All right, so the timer's going off. So put my towel down. It's been baking for 45 minutes now. And at this point, we're going to continue the end of the bake with the lid off, but I just wanted to show you, see how much more color has been put on the bread at this point. It's a nice kind of golden hue. This is the color that I think a lot of people look for in their bread. I like the more European style. I like a little darker color. And it's not quite finished cooking yet. So, you know, if you like this color, by all means, you know, leave the lid on a little longer while you finish cooking. But I'm gonna pop it back in the oven. I think feels pretty light. It's almost there. I think 10 minutes will do it, and then it'll be ready to come out. I will also be baking my sticky buns here in the next 30 minutes, I think. Let me pop down here. They're definitely getting big. They're starting to feel soft. You can see, like, let me see if I can get the right angle here on this guy, if you start to see these kind of holes coming through, that's a good indicator that this dough is really starting to puff up a lot. It's getting really soft and it's growing a lot, so it's just about ready to go in the oven. So as soon as my bread comes out, I'm gonna turn the oven down and put these in. And I am just gonna spray a little bit with a spray bottle when I stick them in to kind of help keep the tops from drying out too much. But yeah, so these will be ready to bake, and I will of course post photos when those come out. And the one thing that I want to note with baking your sticky buns, when they come out of the oven, set a 5-minute timer. Put them on the counter for 5 minutes and let them cool a little bit, and then you want to take and flip your pan over onto like a cutting board. I wouldn't do a cooling rack necessarily because the glaze is going to run down the sides of the bun and you'll just have a mess on your hand, but a sheet tray, a cutting board, a serving platter, whatever you want to use, just kind of like set it on top of the buns, flip them over and knock them out. And that should keep them from sticking, because once that glaze cools, it's going to be really difficult to unmold them, and you're going to have to go around with a knife and they might tear a little bit. So let it sit for 5 minutes when it comes out of the oven, and then invert them onto a tray and let them cool at least a little bit after that before you dive in, because I don't want you to burn yourself. But yeah, the rest I will make sure to follow up with photos, and then I'll be posting these edited videos to the YouTube channel as soon as I get time to edit them down, hopefully by the end of the weekend. And send me photos of the stuff that you make. I want to know how it's going, and we'll be back next week with more stuff. If you have something particular in mind that you want to try, please let me know. Otherwise, I will come up with a couple of things to do with folks. And thanks for joining me today. I hope everybody has a really wonderful weekend. I'm eager to get mine going with this rooftop action. And yeah, I'll be seeing you really soon. All right, take care, everyone.